why we have Professor Vadim Grichin. He's a graduate from Russia, and he has a master's degree from Georgetown University. He has a very wide experience. He teaches now at GW and at Georgetown. And in the past, he worked for the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank. And also you were in the IMF board, no? In the IMF board as an advisor. And he's already a long-term participant of ASCE. So we welcome you, Vadim. And he's going to be talking about are Russian-style reforms possible in Cuba?
Good afternoon, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Senor Lorenzo, for your kind introduction. I understand that it's not easy after lunch to talk about Russian flavored reforms, and even before lunch. So, however, our gratitude also to the School of Law for hosting us. A year ago, we started discussing a big topic, the evolution of Cuba's position in light of the ongoing geopolitical changes in the world, primarily related to the war which Russia unleashed against Ukraine, and the impact of that geopolitics on various markets and economic realities in the island. Moscow unjustified Ukrainian invasion on February 24, 2022, dramatically shifted global politics and economics and marked a new era of sustained confrontation between Russia and the West. Some features of those changes can be seen in this slide. Havana initially adopted Moscow's narrative on the Ukrainian war, supporting Putin's claims on denazification and demilitarization in Ukraine, and has since publicly expressed its solidarity with Russia. However, when we look at slide 4, we can see that Cuba carried out in real terms some diplomatic maneuvers in the UN General Assembly and didn't entirely back Moscow by joining instead a heterogeneous group of abstainers who voted at times on the side of Ukrainian issues. Inconsistencies at this in Cuba's behavior likely come from Havana's ongoing primordial fears of new Western sanctions. Thus, every UN resolution adopted on Ukraine, despite the seeming irrelevance of such votes, since Russia can use its veto in the UN Security Council at any moment, does have significance for any future peace process, which could begin sooner or later with a mediator likely emerging out of that group of fence-sitters who would be acceptable to both sides. Some observers also believe that countries from the group could attempt to create a platform for a new non-aligned movement, which from my perspective would seem impossible given current global stage of technological development, projections of which, unfortunately, will have nothing to do with Cuba. During 1.5 year of war, there has been a dramatic increase in the intensity of political contacts between Havana and Moscow, literally at all levels. Dozens of Russian officials have traveled to Cuba in recent months, starting from the influential head of the Security Council, Nikol Patrushev, Foreign Minister Lavrov, State Duma Chairman Volodin, Vice Premier Chernyshenko, and numerous other ministers and businessmen. The Cuban side, in turn, has also frequented Russia, kicked off by President Diaz-Canel's visit in Moscow in November 2022, followed after by Prime Minister Manuel Morero's 2 weeks trip to Russia in June 2023, and capped recently by voyage of Armed Forces Minister Álvaro López Miera, who became the first senior foreign official to visit Moscow following Prigozhin's mutiny, to discuss the realization of a series of joint projects in the technical military field. The paradox of this scenario is that Cuban soldiers have been spotted fighting in Ukraine, both in the Russian army and along Wagner Group troops. Although Russian officials stated that they joined as volunteers and are not part of the Cuban army, everybody understands that these are proxy warfare tactics. The Cuban military has also provided instructors in the Belarusian army to train Belarusian troops. They are often considered asymmetric response to NATO's training camps for Ukrainian soldiers in Poland. Because of those proxy activities, some observers have jumped to the conclusion that Cold War military alliance has been resurrected between Moscow and Havana. That may be a premature conclusion, since the current stage of confrontation between Moscow and the West is different from what it was during the Soviet Union days. And whether we accept or reject this analogy with the previous Cold War period, we should at least acknowledge that an essential aspect of the original Cold War, one of ideological rivalry and animosity, is less significant now. There are also conceptual differences in approaches that Moscow and Havana use today over issues related to public and private life. Putin's regime is presently based on an idea of depolitization and demobilization of society, while in Cuba, traditional leftist concept of grassroots mobilization still dominate in a way that was common to authoritarian and dictatorial regimes of the 20th century. There are also some interpretational differences between Moscow and Havana regarding who the main enemy is. The Kremlin now presents itself as being at war with the entire collective West. Broad anti-Westernism is a key pillar of Putin's system, while Cuba is primarily an anti-US regime. But despite that country's aggressive anti-American rhetoric, Havana has left room for interaction with selected Western actors, such as Canada and EU countries, particularly Spain, which have become unfriendly states according to the Kremlin's current playbook. While we are in law school auditorium, we cannot avoid noticing discrepancies in the legal approach of Moscow and Havana to the family values of both countries. In a September 25, 2022 referendum, Cuba approved a new family code legalizing same-sex marriages, same-sex adoption, and altruistic surrogacy, among other rights, which greatly strengthen gender equality. In 2020, Russian lawmakers, on the other hand, went so far as to include in the Russian constitution an explicit ban on same-sex marriage, placing the country as the defender of traditional values in opposition to the West. Then, in December 2022, 10 months into the full-scale military invasion of Ukraine, the Duma, lower chamber of Russian parliament, extended the scope of Russia's gay propaganda law, forbidding the public portrayal of non-traditional sexual relations. Having said this, we should admit that the Kremlin is ready to turn a blind eye to these inconsistencies in relations with Cuba by prioritizing the achievement of the main geopolitical goal the Kremlin sees, a destruction of the current global order and the transformation of a unipolar moment into a multipolar world structure. Since the fall of 2021, Cuba seems to have become Russia's strategic reserve, along with other Caribbean countries like Venezuela and Nicaragua, that could be used to pressure the US through a so-called horizontal escalation of tensions. Currently, this role is played by Belarus, where Russian nuclear weapons have recently been deployed and where Wagner Group mercenaries are stationed and can be utilized for armed provocations against Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic states. What other importance does Cuba have for Russia? In conditions of isolation, relations with any country are an important asset for Moscow. Cuba is also seen by the Kremlin as a gateway to the whole region. The island has become an important point of distribution for Russian propaganda. With almost 500 million speakers and global reach, Spanish has always been one of the key languages for Moscow's outlets such as RT and Sputnik. It's no coincidence that one of the principal offices of RT in Espanol is located in Havana and of late in Caracas and Buenos Aires. Because of this propaganda network, Western ban on state-funded Russian media outlets haven't succeeded in altering the Kremlin's impact in Latin America. It looks like Havana is ready to be a part of the Russian geopolitical game by selling its geostrategic resource and receiving decent remuneration from Moscow. In that way, also, it's a transactional relationship. Of course, no one in Havana expects to restore the amount of aid that the Soviet Union provided the island nation. However, in May 2023, an intergovernmental agreement was reached on a stable supply of 1.64 million tons. It's more than 12 million barrels. It's 1/3 of Cuban oil imports of Russian oil and oil products annually, and on the sale of wheat and the resumption of direct flights between both countries. Russian-Cuban bilateral trade turnover in 2022 increased twofold, up to $633 million, and for the 6 months of 2023 increased threefold compared to the same period last year. Most likely will be above $1 billion by the end of 2023. Both sides have set ambitious goals, including going beyond the barrier of 200,000 tourists and eventually reaching 500,000 a year. Let me remind you that Russian tourism to Cuba in 2021 represented almost 40% of total foreign visitors who came to the island. Another important step in the tourist sector has been the expansion of Mir credit cards operated by a state-owned Russian national payment system that allows tourists to make easy cash withdrawals and conversion of rubles to Cuban peso. Russian companies are also planning to develop in Cuba several hotel tourist zones, open new restaurant, begin construction of a new air terminal and solar power plant, organize the assembly of Russian-made cars, reconstruct light industry, organize production of building materials, flour, juices, alcoholic products, process soybean cake and sugar cane in exchange for supplies of mineral fertilizers from Russia. The establishment of a Russian-Cuban trading house could elevate the supply of Russian goods to Cuban markets. In these areas, Cuban authorities are ready to provide special conditions to Russian entrepreneurs: long-term land lease, duty-free imports of agricultural machinery, and support for a trading house. Issues of tax preferences, independent personal policies for Russian employees in Cuba, including the right to freely hire and release employees, preferential access of Russian companies to government procurement on a separate list of goods are continued to be negotiated. Russia and Cuba are going to create joint research programs and joint educational networks. An interparliamentary commission between the State Duma and the National Assembly has been created and has already started to work on roadmaps for interaction in 6 areas. Why has Cuba become so fashionable among Russian elites that decisions have been taken not only to increase trade and cooperation and tourist sector, but also to ramp up investment projects that now exist in more than 30 different industries and offer assistance to Havana as its transit from cracking socialist model to a mixed economy. As Russian economists have defined it, a plan for market transformation with social support. On the other hand, why have the Cuban leadership, after an unusual long and agonizing period of reflection, chosen now, as many see it, the worst of options for a Cuban economic transformation, a Russian model, which in the last 30 years, by the way, Havana has officially and categorically disavowed. What is important to note is that we are not talking here about the Russian reforms of the 1990s, or even the residual liberal measures of the early 2000s. This instead has become an attempt to introduce certain components of a current Russian economic system dominated by state monopolism and oligarchy, while based on macro principles. So, why had this Russian system become a Cuban model for now? Several circumstances have been working together at present. Let's start with the more general ones. We have already mentioned the extreme anti-Americanism of both Cuba and Russia that brings them closer together. But there is also the factor of sanctions. Russia has fallen under the toughest Western sanction in modern history, and putting it bluntly, has unexpectedly demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Moscow's short-term economic miracle has impressed the global South, including Havana. Russia's brief spurt is credited mostly to favorable market conditions, high oil prices in 2022, and a broad accumulation of reserves, as well as an agile application of competent policy. Russia's current economic situation has been deteriorating significantly, but the IMF changed its forecast for Russia's GDP growth twice this year, increasing it from 0.3% to 0.7%, and then recently to 1.5%. The IMF data, however, is misleading. Russia's seeming business agility adjustment that have occurred after a year and a half of war against Ukraine have been because of a country's swift pivot from West to Asian markets. This critical shift was made by private businesses using official and shadow channels to build alternative routes of so-called parallel imports. Despite the growing federal budget deficit, there is a lot of money in Moscow now, with Russian investment in foreign markets having significantly contracted because of sanctions. Russian capital is looking for new opportunities under the state guarantees, and Cuba presently becomes a unique prospect. And one more point, leading and efficient role of economic bureaucracy, particularly central bank management, mostly trained in the West, by the way. Many experts have recognized their contribution to stabilize macroeconomic situation in Russia in the period of war. Under those circumstances, it has become easier to lobby Havana to use a Russian model of economic transformation that considers the pragmatic interest of the party nomenclatura and of the country's high-ranking military officers, without becoming afraid of losing their grip on power, on the one hand, and the opportunity to enrich them on the other. Moscow's new reform formula is pretty simple. Winners, in other words, a cynical, power-hungry kleptocracy takes all. At this time in Cuba, the cost of maintaining the status quo has become higher than the risk of falling through market reforms. The good news is that in one way or another, this Russian plan, with its limited and crude response to a demand for changes, opened a narrow window for Havana's next cycle of market transformation. Despite these possibilities, Moscow's Moscow's plan still offers no clear strategies and no clear agendas. From official sources, we know, however, about three main points in the Russian program. The common heights will be reserved for the state. Small and medium-sized enterprises should be a driving force of reforms. And new digital platform for private business will be created. According to the Russian plan, SME would apply by registering a company, paying taxes, and maintaining all financial services online. Digitalization is expected to become a driving force on the path towards market reforms to help Cuba reduce the circulation of cash dollars and in general bring down the shadow sector of the economy. This plan may work, but the tricky consideration is that digital sector of the economy. This plan and digital services are also a new way of monitoring and controlling entrepreneurs, which might also lead to a growing sovereign, so-called sovereign internet network under a government's firewall that could lead later establish digital surveillance over the entire population of the island. This trajectory we saw in Russia. It's important to realize also that such sovereign digital platform would only be built effective if they use Chinese technology. For this reason, we would assume in the future Chinese involvement in the Russian plan, a kind of symbiosis of joint Russian-Chinese effort to modernize Cuba's authoritarian regime. Let's go back also to and look more carefully at the dark side of the Russian equation, where there are not supposed to be any institutional reforms, any political liberalization, or any changes in political elites, and no independent judicial system with very weak protection of ownership, where at any moment the state could reverse its policies and limit the social mobility. A couple of words about the chain of command of the Russian, on the Russian side. There are no doubts that the decision to kick off a Cuban experiment was initiated at the highest levels of the Kremlin by Putin himself, and then rubber-stamped by the Russian Security Council. And this way, a very powerful mixed group of officials and oligarchs are responsible for this implementation. Among them, Igor Sechin, oligarch and former deputy prime minister, currently CEO of Rosneft, state-owned oil giant, and very close ally of Putin. With Venezuela having initially been Sechin's pet projects, Cuba has now become part of his extended oversight. Dmitry Chernyshenko, a businessman and politician who is serving as deputy prime minister of Russia for tourism, sport, culture, and communications since 2020. Oleg Deripaska, billionaire and founder of Basic Element, a Russian industrial group with interest in aluminium, energy, construction, agriculture, and more. And Boris Titov, billionaire and politician, head of the Russian Cuba Business Council. He was Putin's ombudsman defending the interest of entrepreneurs. Deripaska and Titov are in the leadership position in so-called Stolypin Club, a conservative think tank in Moscow, and the Stolypin Research Institute contributed to the Russian-Cuban transformational program. I'm running out of time now, so let me jump to conclusions in the form of forecasts. There are three scenarios that suggest the possible trajectory for the Russian program to incentivize the Cuban government's transition to a market economy. Scenario A, lack of money and political will on the Russian side because of a long war and resistance on the part of the Cuban bureaucracy and rent seekers would gradually subside reform impetus without any visible results. Probability of this scenario, 20 to 25%. Scenario B, with the same level of probability, 20 to 25%, could be a kind of Cuba's troika, paraphrasing Gorbachev perestroika. Russia would open a Pandora box that would become a precursor to the Cuban government collapse. And scenario C, with a higher level of probability, Cuba would become a kind of replica of Belarus in the Caribbean region. Belarus is dependent on Russian oil, has always received Russian subsidies, trade on geostrategical positions, flirts with the West to reduce sanctions, and has developed several high-tech sectors, particularly in IT. China has been directly involved in Belarus' economic transformation through the One Belt, One Road project. As a result of this slow transformation, Belarusian society has reached a point of maturity where mass-street protests erupted, and only thanks to Putin's intervention have allowed Lukashenko to stay in power. Hopefully, Cuba could avoid such a destiny, but Russian-flavored reforms, unfortunately, could lead the country a step further from socialist post-totalitarianism to predatory form of oligarchic state capitalism, controlled by both Russian and Chinese bureaucracy, banks, and corporations. Russia would like to inject and extend some market principles to Cuba's authoritarian system without necessarily going through deep structural transformations, and in this way mitigate the risk of causing the Cuban regime to collapse. Russia presently does not have the same resources it possessed during Soviet times. So, in order to keep Cuba within the orbit of its geostrategical influence, Moscow wants to balance its limited ability to provide direct assistance to Cuba through opportunities associated with the market mechanism, establishing more stable authoritarian system on the island using Russian-Chinese technological platforms, which would further isolate the island from the United States. Let me stop here at this point, and I will look forward now to Q&A session, and thank you very much.
I think again, the Cuban bureaucracy can pretty much defeat anything. I, for a while, was reporting on the various party congresses and the resolutions of the various party congresses, and I've always been taken by several of the party congresses. Raul complained about the bureaucracy, said you've got to be able to think a little wider. You've got to be able to be more flexible. And the next party congress says the same thing again. And we just had the agricultural session, and the tomato people talking about how difficult it is to get any change in Cuba. They had a research institute. They would go to the Ministry of Agriculture. They got listened to, and nothing ever happened. I think this is something you see all the time. And, well, we have one of our favorite people here, Natalia, who's sitting there trying to improve the investment climate in Cuba. And they listen very carefully and seem to be very grateful, but nothing happened. And my view is that that's going to be the Russians are going to find the same problem. What was your scenario being? Oh, the emergence of Cuba Stroker? Actually, it's probably the best thing that could happen. Make the place collapse. Maybe it would bring another Gorbachev, or which would then lead to fairly dramatic change. I think that's actually kind of a bit of a possibility, because clearly the leadership has no idea what they're doing. To a large extent, knows that they don't know what they're doing, and will be experimenting and looking for some sort of savior. So, not a possibility. I know nothing about Belarus, so I won't comment about that. But again, the key elements that Russia can provide Cuba have always been oil. Oil was just a major bottleneck for Cuba. The Venezuelans came in and really helped out, and there was considerable prosperity in Cuba following the deal with the Venezuelans. Venezuela is now broke, probably has trouble meeting its current commitments to Cuba. So oil is going to be very important. Maybe transportation goods, maybe some infrastructure. So that could help. I'm going to create a Belarus and the political dependence of a Belarus on Russia. I think it'd be much more difficult. Cubans are very nationalistic. And my last visit to Cuba was quite a few years ago. I was talking to other embassies. I said, you know, they're not going to listen to you, the Americans, but they're not going to listen to anybody else either. They're going to do their own thing, whatever they think it is. And I think that's going to be, again, a continuing trend that's Jesus got those men. Right. I have a lot of other comments. Hold on a second. There are attempts to help out the Cuban economy now. I was looking at the list of light industry that you had. I don't see it up there, but most of that stuff's been tried in Cuba. The creation of derivatives from oil, the creation of derivatives from sugar, have all been discussed as long as I've been following Cuba. Some of these things got started and they died. Some of the manufacturing got started and died. I had a list up there, I think, better do it, but, you know, Russia getting into farming? Yeah, they want to create the states. Russian run the states and Russian run farms, maybe. What Russia gets out of it, except as a political influence, as a political ally to what's going on in Ukraine, it's not clear to me, but they've always looked at Cuba to a little bit as an ally in the UN and elsewhere. And as long as it's not going to cost Russia a lot of money, they'll probably be happy to do that. Car assembly is not that very big a market. Car assembly is often isn't practical anywhere. And they had an engine factory at one point from, where was it? Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia or something, that never got off the ground. They could try it, but it takes a lot of capital and a lot of energy and a lot of time. And, well, they probably have the technology to do it. I'm not, again, very impressed. I don't think the Russian economic involvement in Cuba, except for the provision of oil and maybe wheat, something like that, some basic inputs, is really going to be very, very successful. So, tourism, Russian tourism, that is a useful one. And I just had a personal example of that. A Russian family we haven't had contact with for 100 years is now immigrating to the U.S. And they travel very easily from Russia to Cuba. I mean, I was worried to get out of the country. He's possibly eligible for the draft. No problem, good flights, good hotels in Havana. Well, they described the hotels in Veradero as kind of like the Soviet tourist hotels during the better part of the Soviet period. And now in Mexico City. So far, it's been an easy trip. They still got to get across the U.S. border, which could be impossible. And I don't know what to say. If they make it, I'm going to be worried about Russian-American relations for the next few months. But anyway, that seems to work well. They said that in Havana, they were well treated. They loved the Cubans. It was relatively expensive for Russians. So to me, it seems quite likely that Russian tourism can grow, and that may be an important part of it. So that's it, nothing terribly profound.
Professor Santos, would you like to comment or would rather wait until the presentation of our other speaker who has arrived recently?
Well, I can speak a little bit, probably useful measure. And probably anticipate a little bit what Carlos is going to try to say as we have discussed it. So, thank you very much.
You don't need the other mic there.
Well, I found the talk very interesting. I also found the discussion very interesting. But of course, the future seems to be very uncertain, and there are going to be many issues along the road. Since we are economists, I thought that both discussions would benefit from how much money we are talking about. So the question is, for instance, U.S. remittances to Cuba, you probably have your own data, but are probably 25% of GDP. And the issue is whether Russian aid to Cuba, what's the percentage of that sort. At the moment it looks that it may be too difficult for Russia to invest for two reasons. One is that they may be cash constrained. The second reason is the political uncertainty. One would think that if investments happen, or investment is very sensitive to uncertainty, therefore Russia most probably is not going to invest if in 2 years something else may happen. So all those investments will be lost. There was an interesting point probably to make joint investments with China. The second interesting point that was brought up at the discussion is how Cuba is going to be positioned itself given the current state of Venezuela and many other countries that are operating over there. So in the discussion, basically, one of the issues that, you see, when we compare over time Russia with China, and the question is why reforms succeeded in China and not in Russia, is basically because Russia has a misunderstanding of free market economy. So, you see, the question is how those reforms are going to be activated in Cuba. Well, I just wanted to think in more global terms and see, well, what will happen to Cuba, assuming that Russia has too much work at home. I know that they need Cuba for tourism, and they need Cuba to hide for political reasons, given that the doors have been closed in Europe and in the rest of the world, and it's probably for them what Cuba offers is not going to be offered by many African countries. So in a way, I think that I view Cuba as escape for Russia in order to provide certain services that Europe is no longer willing to provide to Russia. But I wanted to think, you see, taking a more optimistic route for Cuba, and say a few words how, and probably Carlos is going to say much more, about how Cuba should be a free market economy. There is a book that I've been reading in the last few weeks, which is called The Chile Project, the story of the Chicago Boys and the downfall of neoliberalism. So I would recommend that book, you see, as a way to see what are issues that Cuba may eventually want to think about, assuming that Russia is going to be too busy at home. So the question is how Russia is going to open the economy, how Cuba is going to be opening the economy, how it's going to implement a vast deregulation program, the way freeing up prices and interest rates, labor legislation, certain industries that are subsidized, and then how tourism and the US are going to be brought up in this big equation. According to Milton Friedman, in those cases there is inflation, excessive public expenditure, and the free market. And I think that Cuban economists have to think about these issues for the next few years, understanding that a sick person, in order to recover, needs to go through certain course. So, and also to be aware of the background that Cuba has been influenced by Russia, and Russia has a gross misunderstanding of the free market economy. So I think that we are expecting a bright future for Cuba. Cuban economists are going to be popular working on those issues of trying to liberalize their economy and get it closer to the US. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Respond to.
Okay, go ahead and respond.
First of all, thank you very much for this great comments. Yeah, I'm glad that it's a nice process. We are trying to catch and understand what is really happening now, because all this reason is just previous 6 months. Yeah? So I'm sure that the life can bring us the third, or fourth, or sixth scenario. We couldn't even imagine what kind of scenario would be realized in real life, because no one could forecast the beginning of the war. 99% of experts failed to foresee this evident thing, which everybody saw. It's not a black swan, it's gray rhino. Yeah? Everybody saw it, but no one, but they rejected it already. No, it can't be, never, ever. But it's happened. That's why we can't exclude. And Cuba involved through this Russian big game and this very dangerous process. I call it, and many experts see it as the hiding way of realization of the Third World War, or third or fourth, so in fact. So it's very dangerous scenarios. So the stakes are very, very high. including for Putin, for Russia, for Moscow. So we shouldn't underestimate capacity of Moscow to undermine the existing order and to influence, impact on the future development of countries who are in the orbit of Russian and Chinese domain. And I'm glad that Gary finally didn't reject any of scenarios. You changed the share of probability, almost decreasing it to 0 for A and saying that regarding Belarus, so there's a lot of uncertainties. It's true, but again, I take your attention to Belarusian scenario because except for geography is very important, geography matters. However, many other features of Belarusian development during the last 30 years, they could be replicated in case of Cuba. So, again, I can repeat this argument, but I strongly believe if we made the same comparison as we heard today regarding comparison of Cuban economy with Chinese and Vietnamese, if we will do it regarding Cuba and Belarus, we will see a lot of overlapping areas. So that's why I can't exclude scenario C. You mentioned that Cuba have no idea, Cuban leadership have no idea what they are doing. Maybe, I can't exclude it, but they have interest. And interest is a driving force. They see that they can enrich themselves. And then they continue in the power and power. What else? So, interest is driving force of these changes now. And why scenario B? It's Gorba, well, Stroika or whatever, Cuba's Stroika may happen. Because the division in the elites would happen. The Russian plan unintentionally could provoke the division in the elite. And this is opportunity. It could be a window of changes. We can't exclude it. Regarding farming industries, believe me, Russia during last 20 or 50 years made a revolutionary change in agriculture, in farming. And now is one on the leading position of exporter of grain. That's why Putin is playing with the grain trade and trying to destroy agricultural sector in Ukraine, to dominate, to be a monopolist, especially in delivery of grain to some countries, including African countries and Cuba. So, but Russian sector, agricultural sector, modern sector, is based on the size. It's big latifundials, big owners. They are based on competitive basis, but they compete with the international producers, big international producers. Sorry? No, they now, they not only can, they compete. They compete. So that's why Putin is so proud of the changes which happened in Russian agriculture, and he mentioning it with oil, natural gas, and the third point, in many of these features, agriculture. Because it was a real dramatic changes which happened in Russian agricultural sector. But it's, again, it's oligarchy which dominated the sector. They used, that's why we can't exclude something similar if they have time. I mean, there, in realization of this experiment, may happen in Cuba. But it will not be the small farmers or medium-sized. It will be big monopolistic farmers which would compete maybe on the level. But for now, it's a long distance to run, and the long things may happen. Yeah? So changes in Russia, any changes.
Give some time to Professor.
Yeah. So Mr. Sanders, thank you very much also for your comments. Just very brief, 2 sentences. I would like to return to my concept, which and my vision of the the possibility for free market economy development in Cuba. Now we see these 2 big platforms, Chinese and Western platform. And the possibility for Cuban free market development only can be opened if Cuba joins this Western platform.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. Basically, this is, my title is Reflections on the Future of Cuba. I think it's a very bleak future, and you'll see why. The presentation will be based on, first, the question of human capital acquisition, of human capital in Cuba. The second one is politics and migration. I'll show you some actual data on previous migration from Cuba and political events, both within Cuba and the United States, that have led to these migrations, and more recently the brain drain and so on. The most recent migration has led in the last couple of year or 2 years, which is really a major brain drain on Cuba. So, just to give you some idea why this is important, for example, in the United States, empirical study shows that for every additional year of education, salaries, wages goes up by 10%. I mean, that is a really high rate of return on education. Also, for example, there's spillover effects of education on other parts of the population as well. In the case of Cuba, I'll just go to some of these. It's very. You have these very. In order, you have to have a system, a labor market, without any type of distortion, where individuals who acquire this human capital will be able to go and exercise, choose the occupations they want to in such a way, and employers have to be able to match with these individuals to be able to really, to produce in an efficient way and have an economy grow. Now, what happened is Cuba's always had one of the highest levels of college education in Latin America. But the problem is the state permits these individuals to just choose a certain group of occupations. Most of the occupations you study to be a doctor, there was the return on being a doctor in Cuba was the fact that you could go to these missions and be able to acquire additional salaries, additional income as a result of these missions. Those types of missions have diminished, and the new laws of self-employment do not allow for a lot of occupations, high-skilled occupations. Then what happened is, on top of that, they've enacted these programs now allowing for small enterprises, and again, that creates an incentive from individuals to not acquire the education they normally would and go work on some of these other occupations that have a higher return because, again, the markets are allowed to function in these portions, whereas the other ones that require more education, they're all controlled, basically. Their employer is the state, and the state controls the salaries, and as a result, there's no incentive to acquire education. So I think I'm going to show you some graphs on this. I mean, you can see this is always a problem here. I'll use the pointer here so you can see. This is, I think people can hear me. This is per capita GDP for Vietnam, for Cuba, for Vietnam and China. Okay? Cuba is the red line. Okay, this is from 1980. The red line. Okay, the blue line is China. Okay, and the green line is Vietnam. All right, so you can see. You can see that China has converged to Cuba, right, in terms of GDP, and has surpassed it. Okay? This is growth rates. This is the growth rates of, again, the growth rates, right? Again, red is Cuba, negative growth rates. You can see blue China, substantial growth rates, and so Vietnam as well, positive growth rates in Vietnam. All right. Now, why do I bring this up? You can see the next figure here is tertiary and gross enrollment in tertiary education, right? College education for both sexes. This is from the World Bank. As you can see, Cuba is the red line, so doing substantially better than both China and Vietnam for a long period of time, right up around 2012. And you can see what has happened afterwards. Look at the decline, major decline in enrollment in higher education in Cuba compared to, and you can see the increase in both China and Vietnam. They're both basically converging. So what you see here is that in the case of Cuba, the number of individuals, these high rates of economic growth in two communist countries, but with more open markets, the return to education attracts individuals who acquire human capital. And obviously, we all know, as economists, that human capital is critical for the development of a country and economic growth. So in terms of long-term viability of a system like Cuba's, you can see there's going to be, as it's very clear, a decline in the number of people obtaining university degrees. Okay, so that's number one, and it doesn't bode well for the future of Cuba. The second, again, is these issues of immigration, and so I want to show you. And here's, I'll read this to you because it's very. This is going to be a timeline. And so what you'll see here is 1994. I don't know if you can see this here, but 1994. Cuba signs an agreement with the United States, according to which the U.S. agrees to admit 20,000 Cubans a year in return for halting the exodus of refugees. This is during the special period. Then 1998, Cuba, U.S. eases restrictions on sending money to relatives to Cuba. May 2004, U.S. sanctions restrict U.S. family visits and cash remittances to expats. Okay, and you see around May 2005, around 200 dissidents hold a public meeting said by organizers to be the first such gathering since the 1959 revolution. 2008, in an effort to boost lagging food production and reduce dependence on food imports, the government relaxes restrictions. Now it's better. Okay, relaxes restrictions on farming. Okay, and so on. Right. So, and you can see what happens in the next slide, where when this is Cuban refugees' arrival in the United States. Okay, during every time there's a crisis, a political crisis in Cuba, and I mentioned this period, or some type of event between the two countries, you can see this period here, that this is the special period, okay, huge increase in refugees to the United States. Then this period, then as it gradually declines, okay, this is a period where the situation between Cuba started enacting some reforms, as I showed you in the previous slide. Again, you have a period here in the 2004, I'll go back so you can see, to around U.S. sanctions restrict U.S. Cuban visits and cash remittances, right? So again, when they do that, cash remittances are restricted. Again, this increase in refugees, Cuban refugees to the United States during this period, and so on. Another crisis here, okay? Again, an increase in immigration, refugees to the United States, and so on. And obviously this, I ended it here, but we know where this is headed in the last couple of years. So you have here a situation where political events leads to an out-migration of Cubans and basically of human capital, of a stock of human capital in the country. And obviously right now, as we see, it's, a 250,000 maybe we'll have in the last couple of years, by the end of this year. That's an enormous amount of drainage of really talented individuals who will, I can't see any major reforms right now that they can enact to have these individuals decide, yes, I'm going to go back and start, and start employment in the economy right now. These individuals are now working in the United States, working in other parts of the world, and I just don't see any possibility for any type of reform that will attract these individuals back with all the talent that they possess. Okay, so let me show you then other. Here's another, again, this relationship. The red line is Cuba's GDP, and the blue line is Cuba's net migration. Now, this is net migration to all the world, so it's not just the United States, okay? This is a slide here. You can kind of see the pattern a little bit between the two, the correlation.
You can see this from
here.
here. We don't see it from here.
You can't, okay. Okay, so this, all right, I'll show you one where at least it's normalized. So that's normalized. So in a sense, a scale. You can see there's, eyeballing, you'll see there's a relationship between in this case, GDP growth in Cuba. So earlier you had the GDP. This is actual GDP growth, right? GDP growth, and you have.
What period you're talking about, Carlos?
Huh?
What period of
What
time?
year?
Oh, we're talking. This is 1990. I don't know if you can see the date. 1990 to 2020. Okay, so this is the data that's available for this period in terms of that. So again, and I'm using GDP data from this U.S. This is growth rate in Cuba's GDP. Okay, and you can see again how it flows. Let me see the previous one. That's the normalized one. I guess this is the better one that you can see. You can see kind of the patterns here that when you see right here GDP in Cuba grows during this period, okay, around the 2005 period, you can see net migration goes down, right? Again, GDP declines during the period here, okay? Again, net migration goes up. Okay, so you can see what is happening in terms of the economy. Now, if you perceive it now empirically, you'll see, obviously Cuba's economy is not growing. So, based on this, you know for a fact that this process of migration is going to continue one way or another. Okay, and basically, at the end of, if we do some forecasts at the, in 10 years from now, only people, when you're in Varadero and you hear housekeeping, it'll be Mariela Castro doing the housekeeping because everybody else has left. All the Castros will be the only ones left. Okay, now, on an empirical, so what I do here is, this is harder to see, but this is a vector order regression, and what you have here is, Cuba's net migration, and these are lags. Cuban, this is annual, right? So you have 1 year behind, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. If you look at it, for example, this here, you can see that the 4, this is the 4th one right here, the T statistic on the 4th, okay, 1, 2, on GDP, 1, 2, 3, 4, right here, right? On the 4th, right, you can see it takes about 4 years for, at least 4 years, for to see this of a decline in GDP in Cuba for a really big increase in net migration. So, you know, what we're looking now is from now, you know, if we project 4 years from now, we could see that in 4 years from now, given the low growth rate, we should see, again, another major surge in migration out of Cuba. And so, you know, without any major reforms, you're getting a country that's not growing, and you're going to continue to get this out-migration out of the country. And it's a really sad thought. I mean, really sad. Who's going to be left? The only ones that are going to be left in Cuba are those who unfortunately don't have any ability to leave. But again, you're leaving, the country will be remaining, what will remain is a country with very low levels of human capital at that time, which will not allow any reform at that time, will not be able to really be as effective as if you had a much more educated population. So again, what is it for me? It's a very sad situation for Cuba. Okay, that's all I want to say. Just on that upbeat note.
Professor Santos, would you like to say something about Carlos' presentation?
No, I don't.
And so we have some questions. Let's take questions.
I wanted to make one further comment to your presentation.
Sorry, could you please use the mic so we can...
Well, not hardly worth it. But anyway, Larry got the Baba, who isn't here at the moment, but he's often been very good here. Why not? This is civility coming in, people. Definitely. Oh, yeah. Think about it.
Carmelo.
How can we sit this down?
Excellent presentation. I have learned a lot. I have 2 short questions and a very good size one. Very concrete. The first one is the data on Cuban, Russian. First small question, the data on, this is not working. Is it working?
Yes.
Okay. The data on Cuban Russian trade. The Anuario Estadístico de Cuba of 2022 have not published yet the external sector. Are you using data from Russian statistics?
No, Cuban.
How do
Russian
you,
is low.
how do you get that? The Anuario is not out.
Okay, I will send you the source.
But are you relying on leadership general statements, or are you relying on a specific data?
Both.
Okay, I would like to see that because, okay, the second is, when you say sale of wheat to Cuba, is this on credit?
It's a good question, because it looks like that they would like to use not only cash, but different, if some groups receive, for example, land for building of new hotels, and then it can be compensated by...
So it's like a trade-off?
It could be different options.
Okay, all right.
Exactly tell now, but I'm sure that it's not only cash. Cash would be a small portion of the...
But also, it could be also credit.
Yeah,
Okay.
credit.
All right. My big question is this. About 2 or 3 days ago, the New York Times published a very long article on the Russian economy. And it was saying that the Russian economy, despite predictions, it was growing at a modest rate.
1.5% this year.
Yeah. But it was saying that a lot of inflation is going on, and it's going to go even higher. And if that happens, that will be a very serious problem for this Russian economy. So my question is, in view of all the commitment that Russia has not only with Cuba, but African countries, etc., how they could, in addition to the war effort, sustain those agreements?
Thank you very much. Great question. Frankly speaking, the cost of the war is still cheap for Russia. Cheap. 1 billion per day.
$1 billion.
$1 billion a day?
That's cheap.
And you call it cheap?
Yeah, it's still cheap. But the future is gloomy. The future is gloomy, and we see this changing trends because it was very short. Economists call it Moscow miracle, what's happened in 2022. But it's because drop of imports, high oil prices, and return of capitals from many constituencies to Russia. So, but it's relatively short period. Yeah. What we can see now is growing budget deficit, it's true. Growing imports, drop of ruble, accelerated drop of ruble, and growing price of war. Longer, more expensive. This decreased significantly the capacity of state sector, public sector. According to many forecasts and my own calculations, Putin has enough capacity without extraordinary measures in the economy, such as massive nationalization, for example, or mobilization. He has enough resources for 2 more years for such style of war, and it's not alone. But in case of Cuba, we are talking not only and even more about private than public money. State just support, Putin just support this initiative for these guys I mentioned. All of them are billionaires. There's a huge resource, private resources, concentrated not only in Russia, but in different constituencies. And under some conditions, they can try to create profitable business in Cuba. This is the main thing, that if we compare the Soviet Union type of aid to Cuba and current attempt of Russia to balance this interaction and continue use Cuba as geostrategic asset, they add to this relatively small state aid this private component based on market principles. They would like to create a profitable business for them and for some Cuban oligarch or bureaucrats, whatever. This is their intention. Could they succeed? We can't exclude it. Yeah, could they fail? Yes, sure. But it's serious. We shouldn't overestimate this effort. We shouldn't underestimate. We shouldn't overestimate them, but we shouldn't underestimate this effort.
So let me make a point. The return to investing in Cuba is lousy.
Now, exactly.
I mean, lousy. You don't know, they can't attract anybody. No foreign direct investment. As much as they try, they can't get anybody. I mean, the Russians are not going to be stupid enough to be the only individuals who invested in an economy that's completely, bankrupt.
No, they have money. First, tourist sector as Gary mentioned also, it's would be an important and profitable part of their business. Agriculture, if they try to do what they did in the southern region of European part of Russia, why not? They know, they have technology, they know how to deal it, how to do this business. I'm not sure that it would be sugar, but we can't exclude it again. It's, that's why my vision of this process, yes, there are a lot of uncertainties, it's fragile, it's not sustainable, but we shouldn't exclude completely that something may happen. And I described you this scenario.
Okay, we have 5 more minutes, and I'd like to take 2 more questions from Professor Anthony.
My question is about military relations, because you hardly touched on that. And I would guess that the military being the only working institution in Cuba today, they're in a very high level contact. Do the Russians have any military ambitions? Do they intend to re-establish some of the listening devices? You know that China, at least that has been reported in the US media, that China has plans in that direction, perhaps even going further for training, joint training, that we actually the second military base China will have outside of its own country, the one in Djibouti. So, and what is the relation between the Russians and the Chinese in terms of military ambitions in Cuba?
Okay, let me take 2 more questions, I guess we have, and then.
Okay.
Well, thank you. My question overlaps with his question, because you mentioned Cubans fighting in the Ukraine with the Russians, but he also mentioned what a dangerous world we're in. And you mentioned dangers and so forth, but you just mentioned that you didn't expand on it. So I think the 2 questions I think may overlap, and we're getting at the same general issue.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So, regarding military components, very important part of all this activities. Yeah, it's because of this contracts on highest level of military football. We see now this plans. Yeah. On the one hand, on the other hand, for Putin, look at again at Belarus. How he used Belarus as an instrument to organize horizontal, so-called horizontal pressure and create tensions for Europeans now, okay? but for Americans as well. Cuba, if we look at some statement made by high-ranking Russian officials before the war started, in fall 2021, when there were some strategic maneuvers and even negotiations, if you remember, in Geneva between current administration and Putin in July 2021. After that, Russian ultimatums and some statements regarding capacity of Russia to create a new crisis in the Caribbean region. How would they then organize it? Through listening, or I'm not sure. They can use even more high-level instruments to create crisis situation in the Caribbean region, if Putin would need it. So again, we are in a very dangerous stage of just political and just strategic development in the world. Putin is losing this war, and he's ready to do many things we prefer not to think about now at this stage. So it's extreme option, radical scenario. But in general, is it important for Russia to resume activities in Lublis? I'm not sure. It's again, the stakes are high now, and it's about the possibility to receive a new Cuban Missile Crisis, Caribbean Crisis, whatever. So,
Okay, so Cubans, you mentioned Cubans fighting in the Ukraine
Oh, yeah.
on the Russian side. And again, I think the main value of Cuba to all of U.S. enemies is the real estate, right? It's based there. So I think that overlaps with...
yeah, they demonstrate.
But I'm interested in what you said about the Cubans in the Ukraine. I had not heard that before. So can you elaborate? How many are there? Where are they? What are they doing?
Not a lot, but the most interesting thing that they're not only in the Russian army as volunteers, but also in Wagner groups. I believe that they study the capacity to develop this proxy situations and parallel structure, which they used in Africa, in Venezuela now. They're also experts, maybe they share experience. We don't know in details what they are doing in Wagner Group specifically. But they are also instructors in Belarusian army. They they train some Belarusian military units using experience maybe they have now.
And these are independent Cuban units?
Again, it's not we don't have official confirmation, but several sources indicate that they are there, and there are some leaks that Cuban instructors work in Belarus.
Okay, one last question from Natalia, very short, and we end.
Okay. When the things you described that Russians are going to be doing is invest essentially in infrastructure in a country that's chronic risk. But then you talk about this large agriculture, and I don't know enough about it, but it seems like sugar and wheat can be produced on large levels. But what about getting food on the table for Cubans? It seems like the successful farms, when I learned from our economists, Cuban economists friends, are the family-owned farms. That 20% of the land that's farmed privately is what produces most of the food. So nothing that I see in terms of their investments is going to solve any kind of short-term food problem, which is being put right now. So it just seems like the investment's off,
It's a great question, because not only in Cuba, but in many former Soviet socialist countries and former Soviet republics, sometimes private, almost illegal sector in agriculture produced more than state farmers. It's true. But the way Russia chose under Putin in agriculture is creation of this huge farm. And not only for wheat, but also to produce potato, tomatoes, green, whatever. So it's their way. Big, efficient, modern, well-equipped farmers, which also can feed the local population. Again, do they have enough time? Do they have enough money? It's a big question. However, I can't imagine that they will deal with the small farmers and medium-sized businesses in agriculture in case of Cuba. They think they have a big picture and they think about big things. So,
okay, well, thank you very much.
Bueno, muchas gracias por asistir. Lamento mucho, el doctor Gabilondo no pudo presentarse, pero esta va a ser la sesión más importante en los 33 años de la historia de ASCE, porque aquí vamos a tratar hoy los dos temas más importantes que tiene el cubano y que tiene Cuba: la remesa y los problemas legales. No hay nadie. No, nadie.
Por favor.
I did. I said it started, and everyone just looked at me like, okay, you're the IT guy, shut up.
No, claro, hazlo tú también. Pero bueno, todo esto se está grabando, así que va a quedar para la posteridad. Bueno, sí se puede hacer en español. Pero bueno, vamos a conversar algo. Son dos presentaciones. La de Juan E. García Cusa, ¿no?
Sí.
Abogado y ex profesor universitario en Cuba. Y Emilio Morales de la Habana Consulting Group. Sí, verdad. Okay. Adrián Gani, graduate student, London School of Economics and Political Science. El trabajo se llama Ideology and the Political Effects of Remittances, an examination of the survival of Cuban authoritarianism, 1991 al 2019, que va a ser discutido por Emilio Morales de The Havana Consulting Group, una persona muy conocida por todos los programas de Ocasa. Y el trabajo de José Emilio García Cusa. ¿Eh? Sí, García Cusa. Panorama social y político de los derechos constitucionales y económicos en Cuba. Como el trabajo de Juan Emilio está supuesto a ser el discursant, la abogada Amelia Rodríguez Cala, que debe de haber llegado hoy después del mediodía, por si tiene tiempo para llegar, vamos a hacer primero el trabajo de Adrián Ganic y después hacemos el de Juan Emilio para ver si aparece Amelia, o si no yo comentaré el trabajo de Juan Emilio con los datos que me dio Amelia.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for asking for accepting my paper. Remittances and political effects or not that they have had in Cuba during this time period. So, during the collapse of European communism in 1991, Bernard Aronson, U.S. Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, he said this about Cuba. So, the system is a dinosaur in today's world. And many other experts, commentators, and people in general, they, I'm sure, share this sentiment. I was involved in so I don't know. So without the vast financial assistance and whatnot from the USSR and its allies, the Cuban regime will surely collapse. But now, more than 30 years later, we're here, and the regime is still in power. And notably, well, there's been very little political unrest, large scale. There's only been 2 political protests during this time period, one in 1994 and then one recently in 2021. So,
wrong room, Gary. I think you're due upstairs.
The train.
108.
208. Sorry, everybody.
So, anyway, in this paper, I will argue remittances have played a key part in Cuba's ability, Cuban regime's ability to maintain social control. Okay, so the main argument is that as remittance flows, remittances became key in Cuban economy after 1991 or 1993 specifically, which led to Cuban ideology transforming to personally favor remittance recipients in different ways, which then improves the regime's ideological legitimation, which is very important for a state such as Cuba, which is a communist ideocratic state.
Lenny, let me stop you here for a second. I think remittances began when there was that about the Cuban family in the exterior in 1979.
No, but officially the remittance started in 1993.
From USD,
When they opened the market for
The dollar was illegal in 1990.
Pero what we brought in, the ladies with the food and the dresses and the pressure cookers.
Yeah,
the flows I will show you money. The flows has
The money.
and the flows have increased also dramatically since that time. I will show a graph of that later. So where was I? Anyway, so the increase in middle flows have led to increased ideological legitimation, which has then in turn increased regime stability. It's estimated that around more than 2/3 of Cubans receiving reliable remittances from this society, a significant part of people that are under the influence of these effects. And then specifically then, I will say that the Cuban regime has actively sought to reconceptualize Cuban socialism following the Soviet Union's collapse by separating traditional Marxist-Leninism from the legacy of the Cuban Revolution and the concept of the Cuban nation. And then such an adjustment has enabled the state to separate, ideologically separate, economics and politics in two ways. So one, notions of socialism are kept afloat by the provisions of public goods such as healthcare and education. And then two, it's been accepted that partial marketization reforms are necessary to ensure the survival of the revolution. And then within this sort of new construct, remittance recipients, there are two consequences for their relationship with the state. So firstly, like citizens in general, they receive these social provisions, and then in particular, they benefit from the available capitalist opportunities disproportionately, while viewed by the state and by themselves as well, as the defenders of this new Cuban socialism. And together, these mechanisms make remittance recipients perceive the Cuban society model as exceptional, that's the word that I used, which then leads to first, it insulates them from democratic non-diffusion through certain theoretical effects from remittance flows that are in the literature, and secondly, a large part of the population has effectively been more or less co-opted into accepting and strengthening the regime's ideological claim to rule. And I call this process the insulation effect. As we'll see later, I have a full figure as well. And moreover, I also posit that, based on Carmelo Mesalago and Orpheus Lopez theory of idealist, pragmatic, and stagnation policy cycles, the regime has modified its ideology within this new framework to mold remittance recipients' perception of the Cuban society model in tune with an economic quote-unquote reality. So that this insulation effect is reinforced and ruled with further, the regime ruled with further influence. Okay, so in the literature, Cuba is characterized as a communist ideocracy, meaning that it's a type of state that derives its right to govern and reshape society mainly through ideological claims, not from material outputs such as economic growth. And ideocracies also have other characteristics distinguishing them from other types of autocracy. So they seek to integrate citizens into the state structure more firmly, which affects individuals' cost-benefit calculations, which is challenging the regime, despite increasing doubts about the regime's legitimacy. And because of this, ideocracies have been called welfare dictatorships based on, a quid pro quo of the satisfaction of consumption needs for political standstill. So ideology is key for Cuba's claim to power. And then remittances have since 1993 at least, become one of the state's main sources for hard currency and revenue. Some estimates say that, as the graph shows, even conservative estimates here show the remittance flows have increased dramatically since the early 1990s. So these calculations you see here, between 2 and 3 billion, they put remittances at the largest It's the third largest, source of USD revenue for the state, who had Emilio's higher estimate. These remittances dwarf the value of Cuba's total exports, including tourism. So the Cuban state's quest for remittances since 1993 has come in different forms. These are some of the examples here. USD circulation was decriminalized. Aptly named stores were opened up to buy certain goods in USD, and then these were heavily taxed by the state. These stores were profits. It's estimated that 75 to 85% of Cubans spent 85% of their remittances at these stores in the early 2000s. And also we have different types of schemes there. So state-owned enterprises partnered with international money firms like Western Union to profit additionally from remittance flows in the early 2000s. And then the system has been in place since, more or less, and profits have increased as the flows also have increased. And during the 2010s, remittances gained an additional function for compensating the state's lackluster banking culture and credit institutions to cover new demand for small business loans as the economy gets more privatized. And now we need to take a bit of a deeper look. From an autocratic point of view, there are potential problems, as I alluded to earlier, with relying too heavily on remittance flows for your ability to stay power, particularly if you remittance sending diaspora placed in democratic states, such as the U.S.
5 more minutes.
Only 5. It's been 15 minutes.
50.
15. It's been
15, yeah. You started at 4:13. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to skip this then. So there are political remittances. Some of them are social effects. So the norm diffusion can happen through remittance flows. And these are the different literature. Here's why is this happening in Cuba? I would argue now quickly here then that the ideology that has morphed during the state here isolates remittance recipients from democratic norm diffusion as well. Okay? So how has the Cuban government transformed this ideology then? It's done 2 things. It's emphasized nationalism and national heritage instead of traditional communist rhetoric here. So there was a concerted effort in the 1990s to do that. Here are some examples. I have more evidence in the paper, as you might imagine, but it says these things. The National Assembly in 1992 omitted the mention of the USSR from the preamble to the Constitution, and José Martí was elevated to father of the nation. And also the Communist Party was renamed to Party of the Cuban People instead of Party of the Cuban Workers. That show kind of this shift, and then the Battle of Ideas furthered this thought in the early 2000s. Another big part of it, of course, is marketization. When the USSR crashed, things needed to be done. So these are some examples of that. Big reforms were undertaken. Tourism was promoted. Foreigners could buy real estate. Self-employment was authorized for a number of occupations. Here and there we have, it was also framed as a way to save the revolution. So there's some examples as well. Over the Carlos III shopping mall in Santa Helena, we had a sign at the time reading, "In the new millennium, sales plus economy plus efficiency equals revolution." For example, there are other examples. So by framing what's essentially a structure adjustment program to the economy in these terms, the regime's goal was very clear: to reconceptualize the legacy of the revolution and maintain, through the maintenance of rudimentary public goods such as education, etc., and the survival of party rule as well. This ideological construct continued and was made more permanent. Democratization efforts under Raúl's presidency, despite increased inequality, so people who in conference have touched upon. There is some literature that touches on that. So, if Cuban regime has managed to turn its ideology into something different, so I call it post-communism here, and you can call it whatever you want to. So, on the one hand, they have been able to frame the implementation of marketization reforms as a way to keep the revolution afloat. And on the other hand, too, the citizenry is provided is provided with public goods that's viewed as maintenance of socialism. And crucially, at least in 2019, it seems to have worked a bit too. There's limited data, of course, for these things, but we have 2 surveys here that were conducted. There you can see there are different data points that I picked out. The key, I think, is in the 2015 one, the third row. So that citizens have disassociated economic development from the type of socialism that the government provides. You can see that there's a discrepancy in how people rate the economic and political system, and also people seem to like the healthcare and education system as well. So that leads us into the insulation effect. This is the result of the change of ideology. Since I don't have a lot of time left, I will skip these parts and show you this cool graph. So you can see kind of what's happening here. All the different parts that we've been talking about here come together. So ideology, the construct promoted remittances, capitalist opportunities, and socialism and public good provision, which then allows recipients to increase consumption or get money or whatever, which then allows them to perceive the society more or less exceptional, which then has a feedback loop into the ideological construct and go around. And I have an additional point here, because you might think, if you're a U.S. diplomat, like Nicola had earlier in the 90s, that increased liberalization means that the Cuban state will change as segments of the population become independent economically of the state. But to the contrary here, Camilo Mesalaga and Jorge Perez Lopez, they argue that the regime adapts the degree of capitalism it allows to minimize loss for economic decision-making and to keep political power. So to show that, they divide Cuba's economic and social policy development since 1959 into a series of pragmatist, idealist, and stagnation cycles. Here are the definitions for anyone interested. So I argue that this process also maintains remittance recipients' perception in the sort of figure I showed earlier of the Cuban society model as exceptional in tune with economic fluctuations as well, which then in turn reinforces the insulation effect and regime rules for perspective. Because in these cycles, two of the policy areas that are changed are public goods provision and self-employment. And as we saw here earlier, these policy areas are crucial for the post-communist ideological construct, and two of the three variables also enabling remittance recipients to perceive the Cuban society model as exceptional through the insulation effect as well. So you could also call policy cycles after 1991 ideological cycles too. And here we see that it lines up pretty well actually with GDP growth here. How much time?
Right, finished.
Okay, good. So as you can see here, the cycle up until 1986 didn't really match up with economic growth based on the parameters that we see here, and that can be attributed to Cold War politics and also financial aid that kind of from the USSR that comes to the irrespective of domestic economic conditions. But then after 1991, I feel like the argument shows pretty clearly here. So in the 90s, as we saw earlier, the regime implemented a lot of reforms to get the economy under control, GDP up, pragmatism. Between 1996 and 2003, as the economy stabilizes, we had a stagnation phase, and as a political stagnation phase, and some of the privatization measures are removed or reversed. And then between 2003 and 2006, many reforms were completely repealed, public goods provision increased, and where we see here a GDP increase, according to Mesalaga and Perez Lopez, this is down to statistical manipulation of public good. And then we see as the economy dips again, after these idealist policies, marketization reforms are implemented, lineamientos are implemented, which was the extension of the 90s reforms. And as the economy stabilizes here, we can see the little peak, around 2015. There is again a measure from the regime to halt several permanent policies. For example, in January 26, effort was started to restore price controls on 23 basic products. State increased distribution and selling of food at fixed prices. Citing these feasts. And then finally, though, why is this important? This is a bit speculative, right? But Linz and Stepan, they argue, we've been talking about that, was totalitarianism throughout this conflict, that a country transitioning to what they call totalitarianism will experience a quote, growing empirical disjunction between official ideological claims and reality, leading to performance legitimacy taking precedence over ideological claims to sustain and achieve rule. And we didn't have time to show that, but a heightened emphasis on performance and ideological legitimacy risks making remittance recipients more susceptible to democratic norms through these theoretical effects in the literature. So some of the puzzle mechanisms, they emphasize that. And given that such a large number of Cubans receive remittances, this is not something that the regime wants to dabble in, especially very dangerous to break this sort of trends. And then, as we have seen finally, the Cuban post-communist construct is contingent on an equilibrium between socialism, public good provision, and partial marketization, right? So, due to economic fluctuations, this equilibrium needs to be managed over time to stop this ideological bubble from bursting. So, by balancing idealism and pragmatism according to economic trends, the regime's ideology remains consistent with a form of reality, modifying the ideological expectations as well of remittance recipients within the new post-communist framework. The result, I argue that, is the persistence of the distinct Cuban societal model with the highest of remittance recipients, and then an entrenchment of regime rule.
Thank you, Adrian. I hope you feel encouraged to come back year after year because we're tired of Emilio. We want new people with new ideas, making sure that there's a new perspective.
We'll need more time next time.
Okay. I'm trying to keep it short because in this specific panel, the interaction between the public and the presenter and the discussant, I think is very important. So, Emilio, if you want to comment on him now, or you prefer to comment after? Okay, go ahead now. So the ideas are fresh.
Okay. Voy a hablar en español, pero
Sí.
inglés no me...
No, está bien. La audiencia te lo agradece.
Creo que tu trabajo es excelente. ¿Puedo hablar desde aquí? Mejor.
No, allí tienes micrófono. Ahí.
Mi nombre es Emilio Morales, presidente de Banco Sur Cuba. ¿Cómo me conocen? ¿Cómo está el combustible?
No, está prendido, no tiene que acercarte más.
Sí, te tienes que hacer.
No,
solo con la mano. Pero tú no ves la lucecita verde.
No.
Tiene que tener la lucecita verde.
¿Hello? ¿Hello? No funciona. No.
Se te oye. Y, Emilio, 18 minutos, ¿está bien?
Sí. Bueno, voy a hablar con un soprano, a ver si me escuchan. Les decía que el trabajo de Dani. Ahora sí.
Así que bueno.
Decía que el trabajo de Dani es como un trabajo forense que él ha hecho desde el punto de vista económico y ideológico del impacto de la remesa y más bien él trata de dibujar la jugada que hizo el régimen con las remesas para sobrevivir. Y en realidad, cuando Fidel Castro acude a las remesas, fue en un momento de una situación bien compleja, porque fue en los años 90 cuando perdieron todo el subsidio soviético y el apoyo financiero del campo socialista. Cuba había perdido el 85% de su comercio. Entonces, era preferible aceptar ciertas cosas que en el pasado eran negadas ideológicamente y económicamente antes de sucumbir ante el hambre y una rebelión popular. Entonces ellos decidieron correr los riesgos con abrir el mercado de remesas que iba a venir de los emigrados que fueron marginados y que se fueron por cuestiones políticas de Cuba, emigraron por cuestiones políticas, y de pronto su llegada y esa cantidad de dólares que iban a depositar en los hogares cubanos iba a traer un impacto ideológico en la población, sobre todo un impacto ideológico en toda la labor política que había hecho el gobierno durante mucho tiempo, negando y reprimiendo a esas personas que se fueron y ahora estaban recibiendo. Como parte de esa estrategia, ellos cambiaron hasta el discurso oficial con respecto a la diáspora que se había ido, de alguna manera. Ya no eran los gusanos, ahora era la comunidad cubana en el exterior. Ellos cambiaron ese discurso, atemperaron la situación en la medida que ese movimiento de remesa iba creciendo y asumieron los riesgos de lo que podía pasar. Porque, uno, el dinero no iba a venir de un subsidio soviético, iba a venir de manos de los cubanos que emigraron. Dos, eso podía disminuir el impacto ideológico o la cortina de hierro ideológica que había construido el gobierno durante mucho tiempo. Y tres, se abría una ventana para intentar crear una clase media en Cuba que no existía en ese momento. Entonces, con esos tres factores empezó a caminar el tema de las remesas, que de una manera muy rápida, junto con las otras medidas que tomó el gobierno en aquel entonces, sacaron poco a poco al país de la crisis del periodo especial. O sea, empezaron a acabar los apagones, subió el mercado minorista dolarizado, se permitió de forma limitada el trabajo por cuenta propia y la economía empezó a tener una dinámica que fue creciendo en la medida que iba pasando los años. Las remesas tomaron una fuerza tal que se convirtieron prácticamente en el principal renglón de entrada de divisa del país. Entonces, más bien era el sustento financiero que los ayudó a respirar y a esperar la llegada de Chávez, que llegó en el año 99. Y ahí fue donde entró la otra parte del dinero que era por el petróleo. Mientras tanto, las remesas siguieron creciendo, siguieron jugando un papel importante, sobre todo ya en la segunda etapa, cuando Raúl Castro toma el poder, después que Fidel Castro cae enfermo, y empieza a hacer reformas. Entonces tuvo su punto clímax cuando en el 2011 aprueba los lineamientos del partido, el Congreso del partido, y empiezan a implementarse una serie de reformas que, junto posteriormente con el deshielo, hubo una explosión de remesas. Bueno, en el año 2013, como bien ustedes saben, el gobierno cubano autorizó los viajes de los cubanos al exterior, hasta este momento eran prohibidos, autorizó la venta de casas y de autos, y había aumentado, digamos, el radio de acción de los trabajos por cuenta propia. Sí, ya no eran 121 modalidades, subieron a 201 modalidades y además le dieron más oportunidades, no estaban tan restringidas en ciertas cosas. Entonces, todas esas medidas juntas hicieron que las remesas crecieran un poco más. Y en ese momento, en el 2014, se produce el deshielo con Estados Unidos, y es cuando las remesas toman un nivel más fuerte, porque empezaron a financiar muchos de esos negocios privados, que a la postre terminaron en el año 2016, ya tenían más de 600.000 personas oficialmente con una licencia para hacer el trabajo por cuenta propia. Sin embargo, el gobierno, sabiendo el riesgo que tomaba a esta apertura de remesas, ellos crearon siempre un mecanismo para controlarlas. Nunca se dieron el espacio de las remesas al sector privado. Eso no existe en Cuba. Las remesas son 100% controladas por el gobierno y específicamente por las Fuerzas Armadas. En un principio por la Corporación Siemens, que no pertenecía a esa, y después por la propia Corporación Siemens, que ya pertenecía a esa a partir del año 2017. Entonces, en este movimiento de emprendimiento que iba caminando como una bola de nieve, el Estado, o más bien ASCE, empezó a perder cuotas de mercado en la economía, en varios sectores que eran los que más generaban ingresos en divisa voy a poner aquí un gráfico. ¿Me la puedes conectar? ¿Puedes conectar aquí?
No, de ahí no tiene que darme la...
No. ¿Me puedes conectar conmigo ahora? No, estoy aquí. Bueno, yo sé.
Si lo puedes conectar a Zoom, como está abierto ahí, quizás pueda compartir la pantalla y se vea. Sí.
Yo lo digo en palabras, no importa. En el año 2010, en el sector hotelero, la capacidad de hospedaje del sector privado era sobre el 20%, pero en el 2016 era el 47%. ¿Sí? La velocidad con que creció el contrapropismo en ese periodo de tiempo fue mayor que la velocidad que creció el gobierno. ¿Correcto? En el sector de los restaurantes y los bares, en el 2010 el cuentapropismo tenía el 30% del mercado, en el 2016 el 79%, ya lo sobrepasaba. En el transporte, la relación era 60-40. El sector privado sobrepasaba al sector estatal. Entonces, viendo esta situación, teníamos que en el polo turístico de La Habana, el cuentapropismo dominaba el 60% de la capacidad habitacional de la ciudad. En Miñales manejaba el 90% y en Trinidad el 90%. Eran los tres polos prácticamente, exceptuando Varadero y Los Cayos, los más importantes del país. ¿Qué pasó? Se detuvieron las reformas. Hubo un mayor control de las remesas. Se empezaron a demonizar los emprendedores. Cogieron presos a varios como castigo, los pusieron en la prensa, los pusieron como delincuentes, como personas que se estaban haciendo ricos, etcétera, etcétera. Y ahí empezó a declinar todo el sector privado. Para ese entonces, el sector privado cubano, voy a decir, facturaba casi $4 millones entre todas esas modalidades, incluida la de un negocio que no era autorizado, pero que el gobierno cubano lo permitió, se hizo lo de la lista loca, que era viajar al exterior y traer mercancía para vender. Ese negocio específicamente le hizo mucho daño a la ASCE, a las redes minoristas en dólares. Entonces, a partir de entonces, todas las reformas de los lineamientos fueron cortadas de un golpe. Junto con eso vinieron los ataques sónicos a los diplomáticos norteamericanos y canadienses. Era la forma ya de cortar la relación con el deshielo. No les interesaba el deshielo. A ellos les hizo mucho daño el discurso de Obama en La Habana. Al otro día de Obama haberse ido, toda la prensa cubana arremetió contra Obama diciendo que ese proyecto era un caballo de Troya. Y ahí empezó a escalar la mala relación de nuevo con los Estados Unidos. Y los ataques sónicos entonces derivaron, que fue cuando Obama en el poder, no fue con Trump, fue que se desató el escándalo de los ataques sónicos. Vinieron entonces las sanciones y empezó a declinar el turismo norteamericano. El turismo europeo ya estaba declinando por el empuje que tenía el turismo americano. No fue por otra razón, pero el turismo americano empezó a declinar por las sanciones. Y así fueron pasando los años y fue declinando todo. El contrapropismo, empezó a aumentar la migración cubana, etcétera, etcétera, hasta que llegó la pandemia. Junto con la pandemia, entre las sanciones estaban la de la remesa. Y voy a hacer un paréntesis aquí con las sanciones de la remesa, porque se culpa a la administración Trump de que las sanciones de la remesa tuvieron un peso. Y yo desmiento eso. El peso de verdad lo tuvo la pandemia, porque las sanciones de Trump fueron contra las empresas militares que lucraban con la remesa que recibían del exterior los cubanos. A los cubanos nunca le entregaban los dólares en su mano, le entregaban una moneda que no tenía ningún valor fuera de Cuba. Una moneda que cuando ibas a las tiendas te cobraban el 240% como mínimo en el valor de los productos que tú podías comprar con ellos. Entonces, fue el gobierno cubano el que hizo resistencia para no traspasar el negocio de la remesa, que es controlado por los militares, a una institución civil. Porque ellos querían mantener su principal fuente de ingresos para invertir y lavar dinero, que era la remesa. Entonces, la única medida que podríamos decir que pudiera argumentarse que afectó y no afectó fue el límite de la remesa, que fueron $3,000 cada 3 meses. En realidad, los montos de envío de remesa no pasaban $200 por mes. Entonces, esa medida fue cosmética, no hizo ningún efecto. La remesa, en realidad, se trancaron cuando se trancaron por 20 meses los aeropuertos cubanos, que no viajaban. Porque hay que recordar que la remesa, en aquel entonces, el 50% de la remesa viajaban por vías informales. Entonces, llegando al punto de hoy, tenemos una situación muy surgente, porque después de las protestas del 11 de julio, el gobierno cubano, por la mañana mostré un video de cómo reprimió al pueblo, abrió la válvula de escape a través de Nicaragua. Por ahí se han ido en 2 años medio millón de cubanos. Medio millón de cubanos. El 4.46% de la población cubana. Ellos pensaron que esa escape, primero, resolvía 2 problemas. 1, disminuir la presión interna. Y 2, que iba a significar en el futuro más remesas para Cuba. Pero eso no ha sucedido, porque lo que ha pasado es una reunificación familiar en masa, y las remesas han disminuido un 45% en comparación con el año 2019 antes de la pandemia. Entonces, y lo podemos demostrar con los aviones de American Airlines viajan vacíos a Cuba. Los pasajes cuestan $200, un año atrás costaban 400, 450. Entonces, están viajando vacíos. Las únicas personas que viajan son personas que tienen un familiar enfermo, o lo van a visitar, o las mulas que están llevando el dinero en cash. Porque por Western Union casi no se envía dinero, a pesar de que le dieron los permisos para negociar la remesa con una empresa que es de la ASCE también, aunque ellos lo ocultan. Entonces, en realidad las remesas están llegando por las vías informales. Sí, el 80% de las remesas que llegan a Cuba hoy en día llegan por las vías informales. Y ese es uno de los factores que ha causado también este problema financiero que ha generado esta medida de comando financiero por parte del gobierno. Entonces, al final, han pasado 30 años desde que se despenalizaron las remesas. Ustedes saben qué cantidad de dinero en 30 años la diáspora cubana ha enviado a Cuba. Más de 52 mil millones de dólares en dinero. Otros 50 mil millones de dólares. Más de 100 mil millones de dólares en 30 años. Una cifra que toda la economía cubana, toda la exportación de la economía cubana en igual periodo de tiempo no ha podido sobrepasar, ni siquiera llegar a la mitad.
A las 9 de la mañana.
Entonces, ¿qué nos dice eso? Que la remesa se comprueba la tesis de él, que la remesa Cuba no la ha usado para su desarrollo, la ha usado para su sobrevivencia como modelo económico.
Amelia tiene pagado
en contraposición con otros países donde la remesa sí se usa para el desarrollo. Y podemos poner ejemplos de República Dominicana, Guatemala, etc. En la República Dominicana, para poner ejemplo más claro, existe 1,5 millones de maitines. 1,5 millones de maitines. En Cuba apenas pasan los 1,000. Ahí vemos la gran diferencia. Y muchas de esas maitines de República Dominicana las soportan las remesas. Entonces, al final del día, lo que tenemos es eso, una dictadura que toma a la remesa como una fuente de financiamiento para sobrevivir, no para encarrilarla para el desarrollo del país. Y yo creo que la investigación que ha hecho él es certera y es precisa.
La plataforma es tuya, me llamó Amelia Rodríguez Cala, que iba a hacer la discusión de tu trabajo, pero acaba de llegar al aeropuerto. Salió en un vuelo supuestamente de Cuba, salía a la 1, pero dice que todo se atrasó, así que no puede venir.
Una colega que conoce esto.
Te puedo 20 minutos.
Sí. Bueno, yo hablo muy bajito. Bueno, el tema que nos corresponde tratar es la consideración de estos electrones que es relacionado con el pensamiento complejo de nuestro apóstol José Martí sobre los derechos económicos constitucionales. Voy a tener un auditorio que nos ha dado los juristas para explicar qué es el derecho económico. Brevemente, los estados, a partir de la Primera Guerra Mundial, empezaron a tomar conciencia y intervenir en la dirección de la economía. No surgió en la Unión Soviética, no surgió en los países soviéticos, surgió en Alemania e Italia después de la Primera Guerra Mundial, con las escaseces empezó el Estado a tomar socialismo sí lo tiene bien fuerte porque lo ha estudiado correctamente, no así los sistemas socialistas. Es el conjunto de normas jurídicas, civil, mercantil, penal, fiscal, tributaria, que el Estado lo ordena, no es una ley única como el derecho civil, el derecho familiar, el derecho penal, el derecho de vivienda. No es una ley, es un conjunto, una especialidad del derecho que se utiliza para organizar la gestión de la economía. Funciona mucho mejor en el capitalismo, que ha funcionado mucho mejor que el socialismo, y eso trata mi trabajo. Hay que hacer un recuento primero para entender la Constitución actual, y por eso los objetivos del trato, muy concretamente, primero caracterizar los orígenes y vicisitudes de los derechos económicos constitucionales en Cuba basados en la teoría del marxismo-leninismo. Brevemente, proponer a las universidades interesadas una plataforma metodológica con ejes temáticos encauzados al desarrollo de investigaciones científicas capaces de ofrecer soluciones para la transición cubana al constitucionalismo democrático conforme a la vigente Constitución del 2019. Es darle de comer en su propia salsa. Esa Constitución sirve para avanzar, no todo, pero sirve para avanzar. Deseo proponer a la Sociedad de Estudios de Economía Cubana una carpeta de referencia académica con argumentos y fundamentos científicos para la transición cubana al constitucionalismo democrático. Cuarto y último, promover cursos de posgrado, diplomado, maestría y doctorado en universidades del Estado de la Florida sobre la mediación civil mercantil vinculada al sistema de derechos romano-germánico que se aplica en muchos países de Europa y en toda América Latina, con especial referencia a la legislación económica cubana. Sobre estos objetivos, vamos a sostener la siguiente hipótesis. Cuba debe transitar hacia modelos económicos y sociales adecuados a los contextos actuales del mundo globalizado en torno al modo de producción e institución que informa la economía del mercado, coherente con la voluntad política de toda la sociedad cubana, ordenando renovados principios y valores de cara al pensamiento complejo que nos legó el apóstol José Martí. Segundo, la ley electoral debe ser perfeccionada al efecto de lograr una mayor y mejor representación de la sociedad civil en el ejercicio de la política y los derechos a partir de un parlamento más democrático, popular y participativo. Tercero, la sociedad civil no puede estar subordinada a los poderes del Estado al efecto de que pueda cumplir con su eficacia o con la eficacia, su misión natural y sistémica de controlar y garantizar la democracia constitucional. Este plan de contenido que proponemos es muy amplio y por eso en 20 minutos tengo que organizar esto de esta forma. Iniciando ya la introducción, comienzo este capítulo introductorio afirmando que la prioridad de los modelos sociales y económicos que ha experimentado la nación cubana durante los 64 años de revolución socialista tiene como epicentro y observancias en la aplicación de los mecanismos jurídicos que informan la democracia constitucional como formato político encaminado a organizar los poderes del Estado a tenor de los requerimientos de la sociedad moderna mediante un conjunto de instituciones tradicionales del pensamiento constitucional que informan los derechos fundamentales y la división de los poderes del Estado. Desde el principio de la década de los 90, comienzo a indicar los cambios que requiere nuestro sistema de derecho vinculado al constitucionalismo democrático al efecto de considerar la inversión extranjera del sector privado basado en nuestro modelo económico con reglas de competencia económica, integrada a normas de planificación similar a los modelos económicos de la región, concretamente el modelo de economía global de los Estados Unidos mexicanos. No tenemos que buscar nada en China ni en Vietnam, me parece que no. Esta es una literatura que se publicó en México en el 2016, no se pensaba ni siquiera hacer la Constitución, y ya veníamos hablando de la mente. de los cambios que requería Cuba con relación a una ley de competencia económica. Desde el mercado no se puede decidir, no se puede entrar de decretos. Realmente el ordenamiento económico en forma de la actual Constitución conlleva a reestructuraciones sociales y políticas ecuánimes y sistémicas a partir de mecanismos jurídicos capaces de garantizar el debido control social y dirección de la microeconomía. La presencia de nuevos actores económicos y clases sociales sin representación legítima y auténtica en el Parlamento es una de las causas principales del presente caos político, económico y social que presenta la nación cubana. Por otro lado, razonablemente, la legislación económica y societaria, hablo de la PIB, que se está implementando desconoce los valores de la competencia económica y los principios que rigen las leyes naturales del mercado, ocasionando deficiencias en la formación de los precios, debido a los métodos verticales de orden y mando propios del derecho administrativo mediante decretos alejados de las relaciones de oferta y demanda propias de los métodos horizontales de coordinación e igualdad entre las partes en forma de derecho civil para las relaciones mercantiles. En estos casos, el derecho mercantil siempre lo estoy mirando, el derecho administrativo, el derecho mercantil es que las partes se acuerdan cantidad, calidad, precio. Esto también hay que reconocer que en alguna medida esta entropía del sistema, junto al reconocimiento de las sanciones económicas y financieras impuestas por los Estados Unidos, razonablemente están influyendo negativamente en la eficacia de la logística para el desarrollo sostenible del actual modelo social y económico. Cometen muchos errores a partir precisamente de tener esta coyuntura. Vamos a pasar al tema ya. Estos textos son de fundamentos del derecho económico de los años 87. Resultan fieles testimonios de las vicisitudes y el comportamiento de la dirección económica hasta el estado de milenio. Solo me detengo para recordar que con el triunfo de la Revolución Democrática Popular de enero del 59, declarada 2 años más tarde Revolución Socialista en 1931, se consolidó la desintegración de los partidos políticos que ya en marzo del 52, 7 años atrás, el general Fulgencio Batista había desmantelado por el golpe de Estado que instauró en el poder a una dictadura burguesa, entre otras existentes en América Latina y Caribe. Así los acontecimientos, la dirección de la revolución, la condición de levantamiento social llamado a finiquitar el descontexto y destituir la legalidad constitucional, lejos de revocar o de convocar a las elecciones, oportunamente escribió el tejido social que conformaba la sociedad civil, identificada ideológicamente con los valores de la ética tradicional de los modelos sociales, culturales y económicos del resto de las naciones latinoamericanas, y construyó una hipotética sociedad socialista sin clase social, destinada a respaldar un sistema de derechos sin partidos políticos. Entonces creó un tejido social muy comprometido con la organización revolucionaria integrada, que se denominaba ONU. Esta institución sustituyó a los partidos políticos, en consecuencia, ocultó las necesarias contradicciones sociales y al mismo tiempo también económicas, como auténtico mecanismo político y jurídico para el desarrollo y control constitucional. En ese contexto se incluye un sistema de educación pública y gratuita que excluyó a la enseñanza privada y a la autonomía universitaria, resultando el primer bastión estratégico para desarrollar una ideología que introdujera en nuestra sociedad un sistema de derecho económico en tiempos de guerra, capaz de controlar a la nación a través de un Estado militar de derecho, titulado por algunos autores entonces etapa democrática, popular, agraria, antiimperialista de la revolución cubana. Y en ese escenario, inevitablemente, infaliblemente, se rechazaron los valores del constitucionalismo de 1940 y los fidedignos principios del constitucionalismo democrático que establecía la responsabilidad social y cultural mediante un sistema de enseñanza integrado por sector público y sector privado, Así, los acontecimientos durante ese periodo no se desarrollaron proyectos de investigaciones académicas en ciencias jurídicas.
Sí, 5 minutos.
Que pudieran activar estos vamos a ver entonces a continuación. Este texto ayudó mucho, si se hubiera realmente tenido en cuenta, a una aproximación al modelo cual que hoy trata la Constitución. Lo único que no ha sido un caso fue el problema de crear una ley de competencia económica. Siguieron con un método administrativo de orden y mando, que con un orden y mando no se resuelve la economía del país. Este texto no fue publicado en Navarra, yo lo puse como asignatura de Derecho. Yo fui profesor de Derecho Económico en Cuba desde el 76 hasta el 97, y decidí pasar a México porque realmente no funcionaba. Luego tomé casi nuevamente en otra universidad, en el mismo Cuba, hice ese texto, pero tampoco funcionó la propuesta de la eficacia jurídica es una literatura que estoy proponiendo para el sistema que trato de montar, una literatura que demuestra la eficacia del sistema socialista, que por tanto no funciona el marxismo-leninismo como sistema productivo. Ese otro texto también sobre las acciones económicas en Cuba, donde se reconoce la necesidad de que la contratación económica sea por la vía civil y mercantil y lo lleven en parte. Y así en estos momentos las relaciones económicas se realizan mediante contratos económicos que tienen el método civil. Sin embargo, carecen de una norma de competencia económica, y por tanto hay tantos problemas con los precios y tantas ilegalidades. ¿Qué le conviene al sistema? Porque realmente el sistema no le conviene que haya un sector privado fuerte, que exista una economía realmente competitiva. En cambio, la Constitución actual, en contextos sociales internos y externos diferentes a los que presentaba la Nación del 76 a partir del 2019, fue proclamada la actual Carta Magna, que acoge importantes cambios económicos y sociales sin alterar el sistema político de carácter unipartidista, dando continuidad a un estatuto establecido por el Partido Comunista de Cuba para el ejercicio absoluto del poder político. Sin embargo, en las estructuras económicas y patrimoniales se observan evidentes rupturas de los principios de centralización y concentración de los poderes, haciendo ahora más consistente y versátil el entramado empresarial y las integraciones entre los actores económicos públicos y privados. Esta operación organizacional del Estado cubano a partir de la nueva Carta Magna resulta más coherente denominarla transición y no continuidad, pues aún y cuando el sistema político unipartidista continúa sin cambios relevantes, el sistema de derecho, con serias omisiones y lagunas jurídicas, reivindica fundamentos económicos y culturales que ponderan nuevos principios y valores en la sociedad a través de normas jurídicas dirigidas a descentralizar los poderes del Estado y la dirección de la economía nacional y la desconcentración y la producción de los servicios a partir de un sistema de derecho más coherente, aunque aún controlado por un sistema político unipartidista. Desafortunadamente, las normas jurídicas actuales carecen de un órgano de control constitucional, situación que preocupa a algunos profesores de Derecho en Cuba, pero no tiene sentido de que estamos hablando de una ley de control constitucional cuando el Parlamento cubano carece realmente de una composición popular, de una composición realmente efectiva. ¿Y entonces cuál es el Parlamento? El Parlamento está contaminado del Poder Ejecutivo y del Poder Judicial. Y la ley electoral se mantiene igual desde el 76. No ha cambiado nada.
2 minutos.
Democráticamente me está llevando.
Para darle tiempo al público, que dan 20 minutos.
Pero si el público no le oye, me voy a estar. Entonces, ¿qué voy a informar? Democráticamente, el constitucionalismo cubano se identifica como república parlamentaria según el artículo 102 que reconoce a la Asamblea Nacional del Poder Popular como el órgano supremo del poder del Estado. Racionalmente, si representa a todo el pueblo, para que resulte eficaz, la expresión y voluntad soberana debe estar representada también una robusta representación del sector privado y limitar la presencia del diputado con responsabilidades de los restantes poderes del Estado. Estas entropías originan anarquía, resta popularidad, ilegitimidad y calidad al funcionamiento de la legislación, al carácter legal que tiene para la vida. Estos desajustes electorales sitúan en tela de juicio el heredado principio del transmisor popular del diputado como verdadero representante de la población y defensor de las auténticas necesidades de sus representados con independencia de la instancia política. El Parlamento hoy no hace falta que el partido día y que promueva, se defendía después al final, todo el Parlamento un grande partido y los Estados también un grande partido. De manera que hay que dar un espacio a la sociedad civil. La sociedad civil no existe. La sociedad civil, la juventud, la federación, los seres, todo eso está subordinado al Estado y los dirigentes pueden instalar el Estado. Hay una sociedad civil. Eso es mucho más complicado. Yo he querido, porque realmente el tema es muy interesante, pero no sé por qué estamos tratando un poco este tema cuando otros han estado para 20 o 30 minutos y yo lo llevo a la crisis. Hay aquí literatura suficiente, carácter complejo de los derechos humanos, económicos y sociales en la expresión jurídica. Literatura como para preparar todo lo que estoy planteando. La ciencia jurídica de las investigaciones tan complejas y las ciencias sociales de cara al derecho económico. Nada de esto se ha publicado en Cuba, esto se publicó en México. México ha sido a mí de caja de resonancia, porque lo que uno permite decir en Cuba es de México. No voy a Cuba, yo tengo toda la ciencia en Cuba, y voy a Cuba. Y mis colegas tienen que realmente reconocerlo porque los libros de derecho económico míos son los que están funcionando. Un poco ya, no lo leí, no quiero leer, pero ni lo que me he dedicado los últimos 10 años es escribir de México, a ver el libro de investigación económica, y darle esa orientación en cada una de las formas que es. Ese es un texto que se publicó en España, no lo quisieron publicar en Cuba y lo publiqué en España. El carácter integrador del método transversal en la administración social y jurídica especial referencia al constitucionalismo económico cubano. El método transversal es un método que se utiliza mucho en la ciencia médica y en la ciencia técnica, y otro en la ciencia social para demostrar cómo hay que transversar, cómo hay que consultar, cómo las situaciones que tienen una sociedad que tiene un determinado sector, hay que oír al pueblo, estudiar a las personas y hay que integrar esos. Eso es un método de pensamiento complejo, un pensamiento más complejo que el de Martí. Martí jamás pensó en un estado totalitario. Y en la obra mía incluso cito muchas obras, muchos pensamientos de Martí contra la dictadura. No hay tiempo para detener esos aspectos. Las conclusiones, si me permiten leerlas. Vamos a leer las conclusiones. Las teorías científicas sobre la constitución y eficacia del socialismo son aún solo eso, teorías. El modelo de economía socialista real y su autor natural, las naciones, apenas 100 años de existencia en los países que lo han implementado en distintas regiones, diferentes formas y métodos de aplicación del derecho, con aciertos en la educación y la salud, en algunos y otros sectores de la economía, no han demostrado aún evidente capacidad económica autónoma para satisfacer las necesidades sociales siempre creciente de la humanidad a partir de las necesidades sociales siempre crecientes de la humanidad a partir de un modo de producción que abandone las leyes del mercado y la distribución equitativa de la riqueza, que por cierto tampoco ha podido resolver el sistema de producción capitalista con sus 2 siglos y medio de existencia. Indubitablemente, el socialismo en Cuba, como modo de producción desarrollado a partir de la Constitución del 76, puede considerarse un fracaso refulgente, donde las amargas vicisitudes de los modelos económicos y sociales desarrollados deben servir de experiencia para que los académicos e investigadores de la región que buscan modelos constitucionales encaminados a conformar un Estado de derecho benefactor no repitan las realidades que pudieran indicar los resultados de los proyectos de investigación y dirijan las observaciones a las fortalezas que pueden recomendarse. Tercero, el modelo cubano requiere de un régimen de competencia económica y control fiscal que estrictamente intervenga en el mercado a través de un sistema democrático establecido contra los monopolios, el control de los precios y la concentración de la riqueza en el sector privado. Pues aún y cuando existen agentes muy dinámicos que logren ciertos espacios preferentes que pudieran afectar a la economía nacional, el Estado tiene sobrados métodos legales democráticos para caracterizar a estos sujetos activos del mercado, que trata de aplicar debidamente a las instituciones del derecho económico en toda su amplitud, capaz de diversificar y transformar al mercado como una institución positiva para la solución y el desarrollo económico sostenible. Hay tres ejes temáticos que planteamos. Esto es un trabajo que hacemos para la universidad cubana. O sea, en la Florida también interesa lo puede hacer. Pero esto va dirigido a la ciudad de Oriente, a la ciudad de La Habana, Camagüey, Matanza, a otras ciudades. Y primer eje temático: la composición del poder legislativo y del Parlamento y el pensamiento de la ley electoral. La Constitución se puede cambiar. Eso va a ser muy difícil cambiar la Constitución cubana. Muy difícil. Sin embargo, si somos capaces de cambiar la ley electoral, por ahí se puede trabajar. Y la pregunta que le vamos a hacer al tema, que es el desarrollo de la investigación: ¿están debidamente representados los intereses económicos y civiles en la actual sociedad, en la estructura de los poderes del Estado, Asamblea Municipal, el Poder Popular, Gobierno Provincial, el Parlamento, la Asamblea? Otra pregunta: ¿existe una sociedad civil legítima y efectiva donde sus integrantes puedan participar en el ejercicio de la política sin pertenecer a organizaciones políticas y ni someterse a la administración del Estado? Son dos preguntas a resolver. El segundo eje temático: el monopolio estatal de los servicios jurídicos y el desempeño privado de la abogacía. Eso dice mucho, colega, a mí no te van a aprobar nunca eso, no lo van a aprobar, pero tienen que aprobarlo. En cualquier momento Cuba tiene que existir en nuestro propio el ejercicio jurídico de la abogacía. ¿Por qué un abogado ingresado de derecho no puede defender a su mamá, a su papá, a su tío, a su hermano, a un vecino, sin cobrarle nada? Tiene que ir a un bufete. Los bufetes no se comprometen con los resultados. Te contratan, te representan, hasta ahí, y te ponen una tarifa altísima hora. Entonces, la pregunta es muy concreta. ¿Las discusiones actuales para el desempeño de la abogacía responden a las expectativas sociales de la población? No. ¿Y a los intereses económicos del sector privado? Tampoco. El sector privado no tiene abogados buenos. Son civilistas, penalistas, no tienen dominio del derecho fiscal, del tributario, del administrativo, del derecho laboral. El monopolio estatal para el ejercicio del profesional de la abogacía responde al desarrollo sostenible del modelo económico y social que enseña el actual. No. Lo asumieron en el 63 y se unieron todos como objeto colectivo. Eso tuvo un contexto social en aquellos años. Hoy no es así. Hoy no, la sociedad civil ha cambiado mucho. Y el último, ya.
Bueno, Juan.
Me ha atropellado. Esto era con una hora.
No, yo sé, pero es que en todos estos paneles, el panelista tiene 20 minutos. Y yo he llorado también cuando me cortan a los 20 minutos. Pero déjame decirte, esto es el desafío más grande que tiene ASCE, porque el problema de Cuba no se mejora, no se resuelve hasta que no tengamos una plataforma legal, predecible y justa. Y tú eres un desafío para yo seguir insistiendo en ASCE, que todos los años tenemos que hablar del problema constitucional. Lo que sucede es que los que vivimos en esta orilla de Cuba, hace años que hemos oído ¿Se puede arreglar la constitución, la última constitución de Cuba? ¿O nos vamos a una nueva asamblea constituyente como en 1939? ¿O nos vamos a modificar la constitución de 1940? Esas son las preguntas que nos hemos puesto de este lado de la orilla. Pero yo nada más que te hago una pregunta. ¿Cómo tú propones que tú no hablas del Poder Judicial hasta la página 12? ¿Cómo tú propones resolver los conflictos que se presenten dentro de este sistema mercantil? ¿Quién tiene la última palabra en un conflicto mercantil?
Primero que los jueces proponen que el gobierno, los jueces cuando mundialmente toma una persona de un partido, nombra su fiscal y nombra, y entonces en Cuba los jueces los nombra la asamblea. Pero si la Asamblea Nacional fuera una asamblea democrática, de verdad, que subieran allí de los municipios los delegados, sin importar si son militantes del partido o no, y si hubiera una representación de los cuentapropios, un sindicato de cuentapropios, que no existe sindicato de cuentapropios.
O sea, que tú no estás contemplando un poder judicial independiente.
El poder judicial hay tres poderes del Estado: el poder legislativo, que es la asamblea para mí, el poder judicial y el poder administrativo. Porque sucede que en un Estado autoritario como nuestro, totalitario, los poderes están totalmente contaminados, porque hay un partido que está por encima de esos tres poderes y crean a veces un asunto donde dicen al juez que eso no puede ganar y ya se lo gana.
Bueno, tenemos 10 minutos. Frank.
En el tema de la remesa, ¿cómo crees que será el futuro ahora que ellos están tratando de restringir para la origen de la empresa la extracción de efectivo? ¿Cómo crees que ellos van a tratar de tener una nueva manera o restringir la cantidad de efectivo que tienen? ¿Crees que las remesas van a aumentar a través de las personas yendo directo a la casa? ¿Van a tener más negocio en efectivo tratando de evitar el Estado y más dolarización, tratando de evitar la moneda cubana cada vez a la banca de efectivo?
I'm actually English from that. I don't know. I could guess, but I'm not an expert on the laws, but I have a theory on the framework more. But if just a personal opinion, I think they are trying to. The government is trying to maintain the system that they're going, but in different ways. I don't know.
Okay. Mira, las remesas ahora mismo no están jugando un rol de las máquinas. Las remesas están jugando un rol para satisfacer las necesidades de alimentación de la población, consumo solamente y de sobrevivencia. Y en última instancia están satisfaciendo la necesidad de irse del país, financiando los viajes para eso. No están cubriendo un rol económico. ¿Por qué? Porque la ley de pymes se ha centrado como una camisa de fuerza, ha sido torcida la ley de pymes. No es un movimiento espontáneo de los emprendedores o un ciudadano que puede tener acceso a crear una empresa. Tiene que pasar por varios filtros, con inteligencia militar, partido, gobierno, municipalidad, provincia, para tú poder optar por un negocio que ya ellos definieron en qué sector puedes hacer.
Emilio, déjame dar Olimpia, tú querías hacer una pregunta.
Sí, yo quería hacer una pregunta a él relativa a los antecedentes del trabajo. ¿Cómo él se motiva en este tema tan novedoso para mí? Yo no soy neófita en el tema, pero bueno, ¿cómo es capaz de vincular el problema de la ideología con esto de la remesa? Me parece una cosa muy interesante. Y ese último gráfico que él pone, los picos de problemas en Cuba, los cambios de ideología, no de ideología, del discurso, me parece muy interesante. Quiero saber cómo le surge eso, cuál es el cambio importante para llegar a eso.
So, I'm actually English, so I'm going to be answering in Spanish. But So they changed it to be more anti-imperialist, less communist, more private. That's a given. We see that there are growths. But if that allowed remittances to exist within that, I'm not sure. Probably it's a problem. But what happens then is that the ideology, by making remittances and privatization more of a thing in everyday life, it becomes more accepted. And also when you frame the revolution in the special period, saying we need to, as I said as well, we need to shop here in this mall so our state doesn't go under because we have such economic crisis. Please use your currency here. So it makes remittances more accepted within this new discourse that they have created out of necessity. And the graph that you saw, so I based it on Mesa Largo and Lopez's theory already. So the historical timeline, I borrowed it, but then I just put GDP growth on top of it, let's say, and it matched up quite well. And then because the ideology is conceptualized in a particular way, I argue that it also changes, because big components of the rhetoric is public goods provision and privatization, and those things also change according to economic trends. But that has already been shown by what I use, Mr. Lager as well.
Just one follow-up question, I don't understand, why is there such a big difference between the use of remittances for the funding of the internationalistas 5, 6, 7 years ago, which is not happening, as you said today? It's very different.
La diferencia es que en aquel entonces se dieron ciertas condiciones al mismo tiempo que ponderaban, que estimulaban el envío de remesas para apoyar el contrapropismo. Acuérdate que en aquel entonces tú no podías vender tu casa, no podías vender tu auto y no podías viajar. Las remesas empezaron a alimentar esas nuevas 3 ventanas que se abrieron. Si tú podías vender tu casa, tú podías comprar una casa y convertirla en un negocio. Exacto, eso pasó en la etapa del 2013 al 2016, para que se pagaron la reforma. Todas esas personas hicieron mucho dinero, muchos fueron exitosos, ya no necesitaban la remesa para volver a empezar, ellos tenían el capital. Eso se paró y ahora, por una necesidad, de nuevo, económica del gobierno que no tiene dinero, volvieron a abrir un poco el mecanismo del contrapropismo, pero a través de una ley Martínez que está cercenada desde el inicio, no se concibió como debería ser. Entonces, están matando el proyecto antes de nacer. No es un proyecto como el que resultó ser el contrapropismo, que en poco tiempo puso a 600.000 personas con una licencia y 600.000 más que trabajaban sin licencia. Todo ese movimiento fue parado de ser. Ahora, de pronto, lo que han hecho es reconvertir algunos de esos contrapropistas que ya existían en MyPymes. Casi 48% es de ese tipo. Y el nuevo 52%, el otro 52% son empresas estatales que lo han convertido en MyPymes, y algunas MyPymes que han salido de personas que o son testaferros del gobierno o son personas que están apostando a esta nueva oportunidad. Pero, si te pones a ver los números, por eso le ponía el ejemplo de República Dominicana. Tenemos en República Dominicana 1,5 millones de MyPymes, pero tenemos un Estado de Derecho, separación de poderes, una economía abierta, de libre mercado, donde el Estado solo regula, no se mete a definir si tú puedes o no tener una MyPyme. Entonces, tú puedes trabajar en MyPyme en cualquier parte, puedes ser contador, abogado, puedes tener una tienda de vender productos para una piscina, un restaurante, cualquier cosa que puedes hacer en República Dominicana, pero en Cuba no es así. Entonces, esa es la diferencia. En 2 años de una ley de MyPyme solo han pasado a 8.000. En 2 años el contrapropismo pasó a 600.000. Entonces, ellos son los que tienen que analizar qué están haciendo mal. Todo se resume en una sola cosa. No quieren que exista una clase media que los tumbe del poder. Esa es la ecuación. No lo podemos mirar de otra manera.
No quieren la sociedad civil.
No la quieren.
La sociedad civil era la que llamaba a dirigir la economía. Y entonces, la Constitución puede ayudar un poco, pero mientras el Parlamento, no es un Parlamento democrático, no funciona.
Emilio, ¿sabes tú cuánto representa en el currículum de la carrera de Derecho actual de la Universidad Cubana esas asignaturas
Parlamento lo que
Pero se lo dan como asignatura.
Esa es una asignatura que se da en Derecho en tercer año, una asignatura integradora. Pero desde que se vieron que esa asignatura es capaz de dar la mentalidad al estudiante de un mejor control de todos los elementos financieros, mercantiles, tributarios, laborales, y empezaron a poner estudiantes. Yo era profesor de Derecho en Santiago de Cuba, en esta Habana, y me la pusieron aquí en La Habana. No hay texto, era la única asignatura en la carrera de Derecho que no tiene texto. Civil tiene texto, penal tiene texto, fiscal tiene texto, criminalística tiene texto, teoría de Estado. Derecho económico no tiene texto. ¿Quién era el continuador de la asignatura? Un miembro del Parlamento.
Es que conozco una persona que trató de hacer un trabajo de diplomado, no ya de maestría, ni mucho menos, en Derecho Mercantil, y dejó el tema que no encontró un tutor.
Pero además, viene de la carrera de Derecho y en el Parlamento. Ahí el Derecho Económico realmente no tiene una profesor, o una mujer profesor que diga otras cosas. A ver, el Derecho Económico que a un país como México, como Alemania, Estados Unidos.
Muchas gracias, Adrián, y a Juan y a mí.